Hello, welcome to G&D Media. This week, we're talking about environmentalism and class. Now, it's one of our favourite things to do. We do it a lot. So it was great to talk to Keir Milburn this week, someone who's been involved in class politics and environmental politics for at least 35 years. He was there back in the early 2000s around the actions around Drax, and was unfortunately kind of involved in the spycops saga. We'll kind of get all into that and the effects of that on himself and the movement, and what's not been learnt since then. We discuss who the working class are these days and how the world has changed around them, and if maybe they are in a different formation now than they were in the 20th century, and a whole load of other stuff. So let's get into it. Hello, and welcome to G&D Media. I am your host, or as Ads likes to say, half man, half mixing deck, Andrew Glassford. As ever, I am joined by the person that brings a lot of credibility to this show, from the sunny climes of northern France this week. It's Lucy Burke. How are you, Lucy?
I'm very well, thank you. It's actually been raining, but it's been sunny mostly here. So yeah, that's all right.
Excellent. And as we were just talking before we started, you've got a cool new job, I hear, involving UCU.
Well, So I've been, I was elected onto the NEC, and as part of that, I was then further elected onto the Climate Emergency and Ecological Committee, which means that I can do a lot more work in relationship to putting kind of green issues at the centre of national bargaining. I hope that's the plan anyway. So, and a lot of work thinking about disinvestment and banking and where these big institutions put their money. So I'm looking forward to doing that. We've not met yet as a committee, but I think it's hopeful. So yeah, that's what I've been doing.
Amazing. I'm a green rep for Unison where I work, and as I was saying off air, just kind of trying to get my head around how you kind of mix collective bargaining and climate change together, which maybe we'll get into a bit of that with our guest today. Speaking of that, this week we are joined by someone whose work I enjoy very, very much as a big fan of ACFM and Pro Revolution Soccer. It is activist, writer, and author of Generation Left, Keir Milburn. Keir, welcome to the show.
Hi, Andrew. Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. This week is a bit of a wide-ranging conversation. Normally, our mate Ads, who does the show with us, we let him talk about class all the time because he's got a much more northern Manchester voice than us two. So we're parking tanks on Ads' lawn at the moment. But first, before we kind of get in talking about class and politics and everything in between, the first question we ask all our guests is, when was the moment that you kind of became when was the moment you became climate conscious? When you kind of realised that climate change was a massive problem, you had to dedicate a part of your life to it?
Well, let me answer both the question you asked and the question you asked by accident, because they might be related actually. Because I grew up just outside Swansea, up the Swansea Valley, and the town I grew up in was it wasn't a mining town, but there were mines up the road. My next door neighbour was an ex-miner. He was invalided out actually by the time the strike was on. Oh yes, I've just given my answer away. The moment I became really class conscious was during the miners' strike of 1984-85. For all sorts of reasons, but basically it was happening right on my doorstep, you know what I mean? And I mentioned that, so we might bring it up later when we talk about the complexities of class and ecology and so forth. You know, not long after that, actually, when I was in school, I remember my I think it was my geography teacher, I can't remember, there's the first mention of climate change. Yeah, that sounds a bit scary, but you know, in the 80s we were worried about nuclear apocalypse as well. That was my first apocalypse, was the threat of nuclear war, basically. And so from that moment, you know, from that sort of moment when I was in my late teens, I think I became aware of this sort of thing, and one of those awarenesses that sort of grew quite rapidly. And I remember in 1989 is when the Green Party, they suddenly won 15% in the European elections that were held that year, which was like, I don't think they've ever come close to that anywhere again. And it was suddenly this thing of like, there is a, there's something happening here. And like, that's more or less when the first international agreements around that climate change was like man-made, it was happening, it was a big problem, sort of emerged. So I remember that as one of the spurs of trying to think through, what that would mean, basically. By that point, I was like a young anarcho-punk, sort of anarchist, but like it would be a class struggle anarchist sort of thing. So that like it was one of these things where you had to take this new thing on board, and it did take me, it took me quite a while for it to become really central, I think.
I imagine kind of confronting climate change had a bit of an effect on your kind of anarchist positions on your politics. So how did that evolve at that time?
Well, to be honest, it only knocked me out of anarchism into, my sympathies are probably to a more libertarian form of socialism or something like that. It basically, I can tell you a bit more of a story. Let me tell you.
Please do.
Let me tell you, Lucy, all
about
stories,
my life.
Man. No, at the end of the 90s, the 90s are a difficult time to do politics, basically. There was quite a when I was, the early 90s was actually quite hopeful that, we didn't understand what was going on with the fall of the Berlin Wall. I remember going to like, a Western radicals meet Eastern dissidents meeting in what was still East Germany, all that sort of stuff. And we thought that like, this would open things up. In fact, it proved the complete opposites, basically. And really hamstrung the left. But so politics was very difficult. And then there was an emerging movement in the 90s, the movement, the anti-roads movement that developed in the early 90s. It started off with like very, very far away from class politics or even concerned with capitalism. There were these people called the Dongers, who much more sort of like fantastic. From a sort of like, perhaps a bit spiritual. Like I'm not quite
diggers sure. To the Dongers.
The diggers and the Dongers, yeah. But by the end of the 1990s, like that movement, that anti-roads movement, had basically shifted in towards recognizing capitalism as the problem, basically. And so that movement went into things. The anti-roads movement went into things such as reclaim the streets, which I don't know whether your listeners will know that, but it was quite a big movement that sort of basically would occupy a road, and then repurpose that road. Usually, it was based around having a party. There was a big sort of politicized party thing going on. Basically, free parties were banned, from the infamous criminal justice bill in 1992. And there were big sort of like demonstrations around that, which turned into big parties, also turned into riots as well. And so there was this thing going on. And so this would be like the reclaim the streets was this moment where people would say, we need to reclaim our cities from cars. We're going to do it. We're going to do it on this street. And there'll be people dancing. We'll get a sand pit. We'll get some armchairs out and all these sorts of things. And the big one they did was up on a motorway just outside London. It wasn't the M11 because that's still being built. Can't remember which motorway it was. But basically, they basically led loads of people up there, started having this huge party. There were these people, these women on these huge sort of like almost on stilts, but like with a huge dress, those dresses that pump out, those sort of like Victorian sort of dresses, like, 15 foot in the air, being wheeled around and all that sort of stuff. This pumping techno going on, 10, 15,000 people there. Perhaps that's too many. Perhaps it's 5 to 10,000. Sorry, I did no research for coming on.
The police had different numbers.
I'm sure they did. Anyway, what was going on this motorway was underneath those dresses, there were people with jackhammers digging up the motorway, and they planted a load of trees, basically. And they were using the techno to bum, bang, 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 to sort of drown out the sound of that. And they were just hiding from view. So it was a really beautiful sort of moment.
I feel like there's an element of that in like kind of modern XR stuff, but without maybe the tactical influence of using the techno and the dresses to dig up roads.
All the humour as well somehow. I think, and maybe I think that's what I really, that idea of everybody coming together and it being quite funny as well seems to be in a different space, right? But it seems to be missing from a lot of the action that we're seeing and that kind of sense of collectivity as well.
Yeah, totally.
So did you have a jackhammer or were you in a dress?
I wasn't at that one, honest officer. But like that movement then went into I'm just trying to tell a story of like this movement which started off very far away from class politics, moving to basically becoming the anti-globalization movement of the turn of the century, basically, because the anti-globalization movement is this big movement that people think was sparked in Seattle in 1999, where there's this huge protest against the World Trade Organization and the sort of like the sort of neoliberal globalization which had been introduced at that point. And the big thing there was that the Teamsters, the union, the drivers union, and the Turtles were connected. So people who campaigned or Save the Turtles were connected with the Teamsters. Do you know what I mean? But a month before that, you know, the people had organised this thing called the Carnival Against Capitalism, which was where like it was a similar thing. People were having a big party and a demonstration, but in the city of London, and like people charged up and tried to occupy the stock exchange and ended up having the punch-ups on the stairs of the stock exchange with all of these coked up traders, basically. Once again, I wasn't there, officer, nothing to do with me. So it was this sort of move and by that point, you know, it was much more, this is the problem. The problem is global capitalism. It sparked a very big movement all around the world. And it was almost like the rebirth of left politics after it had been really decimated by the fall of the Berlin Wall, but also, you know, what that means, the fall of the Berlin Wall, is that like the world was split into two before that. And when it's not split into two, and so you could have global capitalism, basically the global workforce, which is accessible by capitalism, doubled in a couple of years. Yeah. You know, and of course, if you double anything, you know, the price of that is going to go down, basically. And that's exactly what happened. And like, that's just a one-off event. That has never happened before in history. It will never happen again. You know, that's part of why it was so disastrous for both the left and basically the working class, basically the global working class, although obviously, you know, things have moved on since. And then I tell you what, I am going to tell you my story because it's an interesting one. Because when the anti-globalization movement starts to fall apart, like there's big things. It has really severe and heavy policing. You know, people get shot in Gothenburg in Sweden. Then a young protester, Carlo Giuliani, gets shot and killed in a police riot, basically in Genoa in Italy in 91, I think. You know, so there's that going on, but then there's also this. I went to a big protest in Germany, in Rostock, in let's say 1995. It might be wrong. It might be a bit later. But at that, right, so before that, it was the protests were, why should 8 people, the G8 meeting say, why should 8 people be determining what happens around the world? Yeah. There, the G8, when they met there, they said, we have this problem, climate change. It can only be solved on a global level, and we're the only actors. And it was like, fuck, yes. Sorry, am I allowed to swear on this show if I get excited?
Please do.
God damn. So like that was, you could then see that like, okay, they've outsmarted us here because that's a very good answer. And so when that movement fell apart in the UK, there was a big debate about what to do next. And that's where the Camp for Climate Action, so the climate camp of the 2000s came from. It came out of the anti-globalization mobilizations. I personally was arguing we ought to go a different way. I was saying we ought to focus on work and on precarity. But basically I lost that argument, and I sort of said, all right, okay, well, I'll go along with it then, because I've been wrong plenty of times in the past. You have to have a bit of humility.
You enjoyed the parties, so why not carry on?
And so, I was involved in that Camp for Climate Action. That form was, the first one happened just outside Leeds, actually, at Drax, just near Selby. Yeah,
I'm from round there, so it's kind of, I imagined you were kind of like on the news when I was, well, not to age this, but when I was a child.
Yeah.
Which is incredible to think. So like, I was kind of reading a bit about the Drax climate camps and, what happened with the police there and whatnot, as they kind of built an iron ring around the place.
Yeah.
Was Drax then just still a coal-fired power station? I didn't move to this new greenwashed biofueled entity that it is now.
It was still coal. It was like the biggest coal power station in Europe, and it was partly in response to those protests that they introduced this biofuels cod pseudo-ecological sort of sheen on the top of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Because it's interesting because I struggle myself when thinking about like kind of strategy and tactics and the outcomes of things. And then you wrote last year about how like the Don't Pay campaign like put pressure on Kwasi Kwarteng and the Truss administration to do something about the energy prices. And for you to say that the climate camps kind of made Drax pivot. I'm kind of a bit blown away about that. I kind of see them as an actor that doesn't respond to anything. So like, was there anything in there, like the way they were talking about it, that made you suggest that your intervention did that, or was it a case that do you think the sea was starting to turn anyway back in 2006?
Well, it's probably just a bit of loose talk on my part, actually, because with the don't pay thing, I think the evidence is there. You can go through and like tot it up basically and say, that sort of trapped the Tories into overspending, and the markets reacted, so that played some sort of role. But like with the climate camp, it's sort of built. It was a very weird time. I am sorry if this has turned into a biographical sketch, but at the time I was involved in setting up a social centre in Leeds City Centre called the Commonplace, which then turned into Wharf Chambers. It's still there, Wharf Chambers in town. I built one of the fire escapes. God, wow. Please let there not be a fire. That's the one bit which you built, which is still there, I think. And we set that up as part of the anti-globalization cycle. Basically, there was a protest. There was a G8 in Glen Eagles up in Scotland, and we basically formed a social centre, and then we took several hundred people up to Scotland to sort of protest. So it was that's sort of, so when we had the climate camp the next day, that social centre was the hub from which it was organised, and the equipment was stored and all that sort of thing. I had a friend there, Lynn Watson, who was part of that. Me and Lynn were on the finance committee of the first finance committee. Then later on, she gets revealed to be an undercover police officer, Lynn Watson, in a cycle of undercover police officers who were revealed. Yes, I mean, another one. I mean, I was part of the group that led people to occupy the grounds for the camp to take place just outside. We had to be careful. I led people through the night to get to this field. We occupied this field, and we ran up to the farmer's house with a big wad of money and said, take this money. We're not shifting, but you may as well rent us the field, don't you now? And he did.
Take this money and shut up.
Yeah. And the person who drove me up there was another undercover police officer, Mark Kennedy. That's his real name. So we know Lynn is Lynn's real name. We don't know what her real second name is. Mark was known as Mark Stone at that time, and it was revealed as Mark Kennedy. And so this was a time of really intense police repression. And so I remember taking my daughter down to a climate camp in Kingsnorth, another big power station. And it was preposterous over policing, insane. It's so bad, in fact, that a young police woman had to be taken off the front line because she was crying basically about what they were, this ridiculous repression. But because of that, basically because of the sort of the uncovering of this network of undercover police officers, which had never really been happened before around the world. Nobody had ever managed to uncover not just one but a whole string of them, and the Guardian played a big role in that. And then there was so 2008 happens, which is the big event that we should probably talk about. There's a protest in the City of London again, and there was a climate camp there, and it was really brutally repressed. And the police pushed over this guy who was just trying to walk home. Basically, he was walking a bit, so they pushed him over, Ian Tomlinson, and killed him. Basically, so it was that, and this uncovering the police. It really pushed back against the police thing, and it basically made the climate camp an incredibly well-known thing at the time. This is around about 2010, so it's really was a big thing, as big as XR is now, in that sort of sense of really dominating public discourse, and discussion about climate change has really risen to the top. And there was a big mobilization for the COP15, which is going to take place in 2010 in Copenhagen. Well, I went over there, lots of people went over there, and we realized, all we're doing is militant lobbying of politicians who are basically fucking uninterested in this. They're not going to do anything.
I was in Berlin in 1991, and I was with a lot of people who were in the Noise Forum and had been involved in pro-democracy movements, and who kind of wanted things, definitely weren't embracing capitalism, but we're also wanting a world in which they could travel and listen to CDs and stuff like that. Quite simple stuff, really. But they, obviously they talked a lot about Stasi surveillance, and I was in the flat of someone who'd been under Stasi surveillance for a long time. And they said every single public phone box had been, had been bugged and whatever. And they all knew that there was Stasi everywhere. So whatever you did, a lot of them were artists. Whatever you did, whatever you made, wherever you were showing your work, whatever, there would be someone there. And it sounds very similar when you describe what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because they used to say the Stasi modelled itself on the British security.
Oh, really?
Right?
I didn't know that one. Yeah.
I mean, that might have just been a kind of type thing that they said in East Germany. I don't know. But that sort of idea of, undercover cops, I wonder what difference it made and what they were doing and what their role was in what you were doing, because to some degree, the Stasi surveillance didn't stop Hanukkah falling and didn't necessarily stop people doing some of the stuff they were doing. They just acknowledged that people were there. And so I just wonder what your perception of the role. I mean, obviously, I think people did really pretty terrible things on a personal level in terms of forming relationships with people under false pretenses, and that's really, really significant. But what role that kind of surveillance had. And I think we're in this really interesting moment now, because if you grew up sort of through 80s, 90s, you expected the police not to be very supportive. And then and now, to put it mildly, if you were involved in any kind of demonstration or political activity or whatever, or you'd been sort of tangentially touched by the miners' strike or been involved in that kind of stuff, it's now sort of really becoming clear that that's restarting with the criminalisation of protests. But I just wondered what your view of the role of all that surveillance was on what you actually did.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say, isn't it? Because a lot of what was going on was like empire building within the police. I basically people going undercover. I mean, I can't remember what. So I think Lynn was undercover for 5 years. Mark Kennedy was undercover for 7 years. That's a large amount of money. several £1 million. What evidence they get? What do? They stop people occupying power stations. Getting up on. That's one thing I went on, that we were going to go and stop in fact, we're going back to Drax to sort of get up on the things, etc. And, just to bring some publicity to it. They stopped that. We know that. Disrupted a few things. But the commonplace, what we used to do, we were doing conversation classes over dinner with asylum seekers. You know what I mean? It was a 5-year deployment there is actually unsupportable, basically. And I imagine they were embellishing all sorts of stuff in order to justify that sort of thing. So it's quite hard to do a counterfactual about what happens if that didn't take place. It certainly hindered the development of the climate movement. But like I say, that climate movement, it got to a point where you realized that what we were doing was basically, it had a contradiction in it. We didn't have this is a global problem. We didn't have the sort of leverage to do anything about this, basically. Do you know what I mean? We didn't have the leverage to do more than militant awareness raising. Unfortunately, that's basically exactly where Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil are stuck, 15 years later. Do you know what I mean? It's I say unfortunately because, Roger Hallam, who started XR, and Just Stop Oil, isn't it? He had this thing of we must exclude gatekeepers. So anybody who did the climate camp and came to these conclusions, and that we must not listen to them, which allows him to just do the same fucking thing over and over and over again, basically.
Jesus Christ.
And it's that problem is how do you stop this then? What do you do about this? How do you actually make a change in something really, really urgent? You know what I mean? A lot of the people who were involved in the climate camp, lots of them, I saw them about in the sort of Corbyn moment, the Corbyn movement. Do you know what I mean? Of well, this is a chance to do something, where you've got, access to some sort of power. Which I think brings us on to the essence of discussions of class and about how you exercise proper leverage, basically, in order to try to sort of deal with these huge global problems. Do you know what I mean?
I've never known someone to segue on someone else's show, but I really appreciate that.
Sorry, I realise you've only asked one question. I'm terrible. I'm terrible. Sorry, I just thought.
No, man, it's great. It's great. The cutting room floor might not enjoy it, but I'm sure it's all good. Right, let's get into the big dumb questions. As I said earlier, I think that the working class in the 20th century are a fundamentally different beast to the working class in the 21st century. I think that for a few reasons. Mostly due to like material conditions in Britain and Europe. I suppose it's a very Eurocentric view. Lack of organizational, lack of organizing and institutions, so weakness of unions. And thirdly, the third one's probably a bit more spurious, that's around kind of culture and says, well, they've been told they don't exist in certain ways, at least for the last 40 years. So with that very rough back of a fag packet hypothesis, I would like to know what you two think about what the differences are between the working class in the last century and them now, and how that affects organising around climate.
I mean, fundamental shifts in the nature of work and how people work, number one. My granddad worked in a factory all his life, expected to. Everybody around him did that. That is his job as part of his identity. He identified as working class, could identify the nature of the obstacles he faced quite straightforwardly as well, to some degree, because of that. Mm-hmm. And I think the massive shift in the ways people work. So precarity and precarious in employment, and this real shift from that idea of a job for life.
Yeah.
As well, that means that, and again, you talked about unions. People don't necessarily engage with or understand the nature of trade union organising in a workplace in the same way if you're not working in the same way. Movement of various kinds of industries out of the global north into the global south as well. Kind of, there's a profound shift there in terms of the nature of work and who's doing that work. Rise of a kind of effective economy. These kinds of jobs that aren't really making anything, where you sell security, or you're talking about risk, or you're working in a call center ringing people up saying, are you worried about dread diseases, that kind of thing. Massive shift in it for all those reasons unpicks a lot of the ways in which previously people understood themselves. And again, I think there are broader cultural shifts as well around this kind of easy sort of association of various kinds of kind of cultural activities, predilections, and work as well. Yeah. So I think that's my starting point for why things are different now. Over to you, Keir, now.
Well, I'd agree with all of that, Lucy. Yeah, I mean, what to add? I mean, one of the other things I'd probably add is is the importance of asset ownership. Like basically, since the mid 80s, wages have been in some form of stagnation. I mean, they've been in literal stagnation. There's been no wage growth from 2005 to now, which is the longest period of zero wage growth in the history of capitalism, or going back to the Napoleonic Wars anyway. And so, what happens when you don't have rising wages? Well, basically, there's only one route to increased wealth, and that is to buy a house, basically, and hope that house prices keep rising. Do you know what I mean? So that is basically that also forms a big part of that. And it becomes a difficulty because a shift in the importance of asset ownership, not just for the homeowner working class, but for capitalism, basically. Right, where you want to sweat assets, basically, you want to get rents out of owning assets, rather than more classical productive capitalism, which of course still takes place, in different parts of the world, but is less important in the UK, which significantly undermines the leverage of workers. Basically, there's a big section of capitalists who basically do not rely on workers, basically.
Yeah.
Rely on workers indirectly, we'll put it that way,
So we interviewed Jason Hickel last week.
Ah, right, okay.
And we kind of discussing in that to your point is that capital right now, it used to invest, it chases profits, and and it used to chase productivity because that's where they were associated, building stuff, manufacturing. And now all this money has just been dumped into various tech industries where there's billions and billions of dollars working on neural networks and AI and things that are interesting and could have, emancipatory, that could be good in the future for people. But right now it's just a massive speculative kind of bubble. So it's not as if the capitalists today go and build a factory in Doncaster or somewhere and expect to make the same returns. If they want to make a quick buck now, they will invent a form of currency and stick a meme on the front of it and then say, that's me doing capitalism, which is vastly different.
Yeah.
But there's massive, you've got this process as well where jobs are replaced, people are replaced. Because that's the logic of profit, right? So you extract the most you can whilst your outlays, you're trying to minimize your outlays. So robots are better than people because they don't need time off. And so you've got this big shift. When people often sort of talks about sort of austerity as being kind of like a return to the 19th century. But in the 19th century, capitalists built parks and they built things like Saltaire and they built, they built model villages and things like that, because the idea was there was something in investing in the health of a workforce because it meant that they stayed productive. But you wouldn't get that now because the idea is to squeeze as much as you can out of people. And that's why you've got this massive erosion. You see it in the university sector. Yeah,
you might get a ping pong table at Google headquarters, and that's kind of like as far as that goes.
I think Google's slightly different, actually, probably in terms of the ways it works. Say, I would say kind of how higher education works, for instance, in this country, or other sectors where you can create a big surplus labour force of people who are desperate for work, and therefore you have no need, really. The kind of people who used to think themselves at the centre of something are now probably the most replaceable and the most expendable because of how the market has changed and the logic of this kind of development. And then, of course, you have this world where everybody rents, and it's the people who own the kind of thing that you rent, if it's property or whatever, or Amazon Prime or Netflix.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It works. It's grim.
Yeah, I bet I agree with both of you on that. And just Andrew, on the sort of cryptocurrency, and AI is a bit like, it's basically the next hype around the cryptocurrency. That is basically what happens when you have stagnation and there's like a limited place to invest as productive capital or something like that in production.
So should I equate AI right now to the Netherlands tulip bubble in the 17th century? It's essentially the same thing.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, I was probably a bit more disruptive than a load of flowers.
But try and get rid of all those fucking flowers though. That would have been.
Yeah. My hay fever was bonkers last week, so I'd prefer crypto to to tulips. Goddamn tulips. No, but I think this, Lucy. Also, I think you were making a really good point about basically there's a tendency for capital to try to escape from labour, to flee from labour. And it's because, of all commodities, labour is the commodity that can be insubordinate and rebel, basically. And so that, one of the places that it flees is into automation, etc., which is why you then get all of the sort of films and the sort of myths about robots rebelling, basically. Robots becoming the insubordinate, taking on the characteristics of labour, etc., Terminator, etc., all that sort of stuff. But another way to look at that, which would bring us to the sort of how class and capitalism and environmentalism sort of sit together, is that another way to look at that is that in some ways capitalism might flee from human labour into dumping costs onto nature, if you know what I mean. Do you know what I mean? Well, the most obvious one of that is, how do you replace human labour? Well, you dig up a load of coal, burn it, and then get your spinning jennies. You know what I mean? All the Luddites knew that. That sort of thing. But it's also the other part is there's this thing of capital always wants to dump its costs on something. You can dump them onto labour or humanity. Basically expect the family to pick up to reproduce the worker so they can get there the factory the next day. You can dump those costs off. Big society, all of that is all about dumping those costs off, or you can dump those costs off into nature as pollution, etc. That sort of stuff. Do you know what I mean? And what that sets up is this sort of, there's a potential there for a form of green politics which you actually, want to protect nature at the expense of humanity, if not humanity, at the expense of labour, basically.
Well, I think this kind of, you're brilliant at this, Keir, segueing into my next point, is this, I think there's kind of an idea in between these three spaces, between capital, like labour, and the environment, where there's a form of green politics which is kind of, I think, has been pedestaled in a way that says, like, green politics means that your life must get materially worse. It means that you can't, fly to Malaga on your holiday. You can't have a nice car, and you can't eat steak 5 times a week. I suppose that's a weaponization of somewhat the boundaries of existence on the planet. And this is something that kind of degrowth gets a lot of stick for, saying that, like people like Matt Huber kind of talk about how degrowth is framed around, anti-working class in certain ways. And I'm wondering, how do we kind of fight against that right now in the kind of current political situation? We've got potentially a Labour government that may happen the next 2 years. Knock on wood, maybe. I'm unsure about the whole situation anymore. Their version of green politics seems to be like traditional Labour version of it, is that we're going to just focus on power and infrastructure and not really deal with any of the kind of cultural side of this, from what I've read so far. I kind of see that as a bit of a dead end, because it doesn't really take into account the fact that there are boundaries to our existence as a planet, which maybe some of the more stronger kind of green politics are. So I feel like green politics now is in a bit of a weird, precarious place between people who are, you can be really snobbish and snotty about it, or you could be seen as someone who wants to, reduce your livings to being a peasant farmer again. So where's our space in that, as I guess socialists or anarchists or whatever, or leftists in general? Yeah. That's not a trap.
I have renounced my youthfully anarchist deviations. It was a different time. There's a couple of questions there. We should definitely come back to like the Labour's version of the 28 billion that they've got set aside. We should come back to that, because I think that is a really big battleground. Not on very favourable grounds for us either, that battleground. But we really need to come back to it. But this is another debate going on, which is between like eco-modernists, we'd say, and like the degrowth sort of thing. And like, degrowth is a terrible way to talk about that. And there's something to be careful about all the time when that. I mean, I'm probably more on the sort of degrowth side of that. And like, the real big problem is there's a few problems in it, right? One of them is like, if you just start talking about degrowth, etc., at the moment, or even any sort of green transition, right? People are going to expect a green transition in which they have no control over this, and they're going to pay the costs. That is basically right. They are very right in that. Underneath that gives birth to all of these sorts of, like 15-minute conspiracy theories and these sorts of stuff, and people flying off, basically losing touch with reality, to be perfectly honest. But like the impulses behind that are that's like that's a fairly acute summary of like how green transition will happen unless the balance of forces are changed in society, basically. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In terms of like the more like longer sort of like the idea of like this sort of green transition, should we be eco-modernists or should we be degrowthers, etc. Like basically the sort of key to that is we probably should be traveling less by aeroplanes. Do you know what I mean? I mean, there are like natural boundaries that exist outside human belief. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether you believe the carrying capacity of carbon in the atmosphere is such or such. That's there. That's independent of human belief systems.
We will find out very quickly what it is.
I mean, I would think it's the problem is that degrowth has become sort of tied to this deductive logic. We're going to take stuff away from you.
Yeah.
And rather than a redistributive logic. i.e. we will spread things around.
Yeah.
You may, and if you talk to somebody like Julia Steinberger, she's really clear that actually where we're at now will involve people having to accept changes in order to be able to have a livable, a livable world.
Yeah.
The thing is that from our perspective, I guess you'd say, well, look, there's, and when we talk to people on the show, a lot of people are like, well, there's enough out here and all we have to do is share it around and it just makes sense. And you think, well, yeah, if that always made sense, socialism always made sense. It was always fairer, right? There was always, but it's about the fact that the people who you might be talking about in these kind of obscene sort of amounts of wealth held by such a few amount of people, they're the people with all the power, aren't they? And it's always difficult when you start to go for and talk about a radical change, economic change that will involve changing that balance as well. So I think it's really difficult, because I think I'm definitely on the kind of degrowth side, but I can see that degrowth is like this major kind of, in lots of ways, a kind of major error in describing what that might mean, which really is redistribution to enable people to prevent mass extinction events and mass displacement and mass death.
And not just that, but like inflation.
Yeah,
really driven quite a long way by so our declining, because that's I mean, what's one of the points I was thinking I'd try and make was that in a way we are living with climate change now, and like that is producing class politics, of course, because we live in a class society. So the cost of living crisis, lots of different causes, but like behind that, the reason it's never ever going to go down to the low inflation period we had before is because the effects of climate change, i.e. Increased extreme weather events and the shortages and the problems that produces, etc. That's not going to go away. That's going to increase. You know what I mean? Yeah. Which means that that's going to push inflation up, etc. So I think what we need, one of the key is you basically don't talk about degrowth. What you talk about is you have to sort of step back a bit and think about, well, let's have a think about how consumption takes place and why consumption has the patterns it does now. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. One of them is that we work far, far too long and hard. It exhausts us. The working week hasn't been shrinking the way that people thought it would in the past. You know what I mean? And that's partly why you have these patterns of consumption, like I want to fly away and have 2 weeks abroad. That sort of pattern of consumption, basically. And the rest of the sort of consumption we have, where we go and have a ready meal, etc., because you get back from work and you're knackered and all that sort of stuff. You need a car because why? Well, look, we all live in Leeds. Oh, well, we all have Leeds connections. Public transport almost does not exist. Yeah. But public transport in Leeds is insane, isn't it? It's utterly insane. When I want to go and catch a train, if it's in the morning, I'm pretty cautious about getting a bus because I have no idea how long that bus is going to take to go and get a train. So you end up getting a taxi in and there's nowhere to park around this. I understand my patterns of behaviour are driven by these constraints, these infrastructural and social constraints, which constrain my choices, offer me a limited range of choices. Do you know what I mean? So what you have to do with that is saying, look, you're not going to have, if you change things in the way we organise things, you're not going to have the same patterns of consumption. You're not going to want them, right? It would make no sense. If you had public transport, which was, really reliable, etc., the need for a car or the need for a car all the time just really, really diminishes. Do you know what I mean? And then you have to think about the different circumstances of people who live outside, peri-urban, but so basically, my main point is this: I'm involved in setting up an organisation called Abundance. The abundance we've got in mind is we want an abundance, not of the latest iPhone, the stuff. You want what the people want. You want more control of your life. Yeah. And part of what having more control of your life means is you have more time under your control and not under the control of capital. Right. That means you have a very different pattern of life. So what you want is a democratic economy, basically, in which you have much more control over what goes on, much more control over what goes on in your area, much more control over how a green transition will take place, so you don't think it's imposed, and you've been involved in the deliberations about how it happens. And then all of a sudden, somebody says 15-minute cities, conspiracy, they're going to trap us in our... Well, no, but actually, we had an assembly about this. we basically decided we're allowed to travel outside. You basically say, I was involved in that decision. You're crazy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? At the minute, you can't say that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's that, like, you have to think about, like, that is the sort of change we're on about. We're on if you want to, there's a different ways in which green transition can take place. One of them is going to be centralization of assets, centralization of wealth and power, and us basically having no choice but to rent everything, cars, absolutely everything off these incredibly wealthy people who we have no democratic access to, no control over. Yeah. And like, just to go back, sorry, I'm a terrible ranter.
No, I asked such a big question anyway that it's, you can pick and choose what you want to talk about.
But like, just go back to that, like the how is green transition gonna take place? That 28 billion that Labour have said, and now they're rolling back on a bit and all that sort of stuff. At the minute, it looks like they're going to be following what Joe Biden mainly was doing in Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which was like a really big, huge investment actually, which has been rolled back a bit, but it's still a real significant change. And like what's mainly happening is that you're doing public-private partnerships.
Yeah,
which is where the
tax credits and pumping money into sectors to let them to prime pump stuff.
Yeah, totally, yeah. But even more than that, I think now, because like industrial strategy's back, so governments are going to be like what people used to criticize the government for nationalisation was that they would pick the winners and the losers rather than the market.
Yeah.
Check that out the window, that critique now, because the government is going to be choosing the companies who are going to do stuff, and they're going to give them lots of money, right? And like this is something that, like in particular, like that BlackRock and the big asset managers, the sort of like assets. People who hold, like BlackRock hold, like, I don't know, something like 1/3 of the shares in the US stock exchange or something ridiculous like that. They are saying this is the way you do green transition. We've got the capital. You take away, if the state takes on all of the risks, right? Does all the risky stuff. We'll pile in.
Before.
Yes, it's a very familiar story. We'll pile in and we'll do the green transition for you. Guess what? At the end of it, we're going to own fucking everything, basically, and that wealth is going to accrue to us.
I just wanted to roll back a little bit on something we've been talking about, kind of about the degrowth, eco-modernism arguments. Is that there's definitely there's definitely like a slither of this argument which is moralizing. There's an argument, especially I think in the ways that Extinction Rebellion operate, as well as saying like what you're doing is bad for the world and you're a bad person. Have you got like a moral argument about abundance, about like saying, oh, we will have everything we need and that will be a better way? Like, how do you stop people feeling bad about wanting things?
Yeah,
I'm not high. I swear, I'm not high. I swear, I've had a bagel.
We must stop people wanting things. That's like a Buddhist strategy, isn't it? You have to renounce all your possessions and stuff. Yeah. I mean, but like, to be serious, like that, there is a real danger in green politics around that sort of Malthusianism, which can often be very, very racist. It's like, the Green Party came out of one of the sources of the Green Party was this organisation. But basically, there was a series of businessmen who'd read this article by what's his name, Ehrlich, who was basically one of the first sort of like overpopulation sort of theorists. I've just read a book called Palo Alto by Malcolm Harris, and it just lays out this like absolutely stone cold racist eugenicist, basically. Basically really far right guy.
Yeah.
Like, and that's one of the sources that fed into this. That's sort of, what we need, the population's too big. We need to reduce it. We're not going to reduce it here in the UK. We have to reduce it. That population of Africa is going to get big. That sort of stuff that comes out all the time. Do you know what I mean?
That explicit as well. Like,
well, I mean, yeah, no, I mean, not. I've got to cut my cloth a little bit carefully here, but yeah, no. I mean, that's basically behind that. A lot of that Malthusianism is basically, there are eugenic arguments behind it.
Andrew, those arguments exist in all of the health economics around prenatal testing, around disability, for instance, and and healthcare rationing for disabled people, and the reasons why lots of disabled people died during the pandemic is cut away the kind of sort of rhetoric around equality and diversity. Underpinning all of our systems is a real brutal utilitarian logic, which says some people are more valuable than others, and that you see filtering through into a lot of green politics and this kind of politics, which is all about kind of some kind of return to some sort of primitivism.
Yeah, yeah.
That it really only suits some bodies and some, and not others.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
that's
no, totally.
we've got to avoid that.
I'm only saying that because I'm like raising that because like we can't just think that we have to be careful when we talk about these degrowth and these sorts of things like that. And so, yeah, and we have to keep in mind, like, capitalism is the cause of this. Do you know what I mean? We live in a system which has got this inbuilt dynamic basically to grow at the maximum rate, and you've got to meet or beat the market average, or you got a business. So it's not about the morality of any of the people involved, not about the morality of the people in, at the top of BP or anything like that.
Well, I think they're different, actually. I think the people at the top of BP are probably have a moral failing in the fact that they're organising the end of the world very explicitly. I think there is a distinction between those two sets of people.
But there is a systemic problem as well that you can kind of disengage. Sort of, it's there are sort of big systemic structural problems that we have to sort of to think as well. People, and that's where that moral thing comes into it as well. Because I know that consumption patterns were different when my granddad was young than they are now, and that's because we're in a world where we're endlessly encouraged to click and accept kids and no, it's not podcasts, but it's that trail of things that we do that generate surplus value for
totally.
I sound as though I'm slagging off Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion. I sort of am, but like I totally understand it. Like it's like we live in this world which is we live in a completely unreal situation where like the thing that everybody really knows is going on is going to really be basically determine the future of their lives and their children's lives is basically unacknowledged at all times. And I always have this thing about like I don't want to shock you and your listeners now, but we're all going to die. Basically, we all know that. We know that we all know that we are mortal beings, but we don't carry that knowledge around in front of us all the time. Yeah. We hide it here, just behind your left ear, so it's just out of sight, and it creeps in, like when you wake up at 4 a.m. or something like that. And you push it back in. Oh no, I'll worry about that later. I think climate change is sort of dealt with a bit like that. Do you know what I mean? And it's got this like multiplier effect because. Oh, well, like it can't be that serious because surely somebody be doing something about it. You know what I mean? And nobody is. And so it's, it's that thing of like, and so these young people like gluing themselves to a Van Gogh and stuff like that. They're running in and say, for fuck's sake, what's going on? Be fucking realistic. What is going on? We all know this is happening. We basically act as though it isn't happening, basically. So I can totally understand this, like a cry of like, please, let's face up to reality. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, like
unfortunately, I don't think it's the best strategy for actually changing things, but like I can totally understand what people are doing. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, this is the crux of it, isn't it? Like, if the end of the world is nigh and you have any power to stop it, taking any action is a form of, doing something. Like you were engaged in the process. So gluing yourself to soup. That shouldn't be disparaging. Like, I really appreciate those guys doing what they're doing because I just fucking talk in my bedroom, once a week about this, adding more hot air to the problem. But you're right. It's like, well, it's the same problem you were experiencing back in 2006. It's basically like lobbying intensely in a militant way to in a lot of ways with the XR and Just Stop Oil stuff is like not to an unknown actor, but to an unengaged actor where it's just like out into the world. Which I guess is where we need the class politics to come in for there to be consequences outside of that particular space at that particular time.
I do think that is happening. I think there is a learning process going on. Like I rehearsed that story of the 90s where we start off with the dongers and then people basically acting and they start thinking and like, oh yeah, hang on a minute. Yeah, hang on. We've sort of realised this is capitalism, isn't it? We need to deal with that. I think that is actually going on in XR as sort of coming, those sort of discussions are going on. I even think in Just Stop Oil as well, those sorts of discussions are going on. But it takes a big shift in like, well, what do you do about it is a very, 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 very difficult problem, basically. And, it takes all sorts of like action and stuff like that in order to sort of deal with it. But like, just to go back again, when I said I argued that we shouldn't do the climate camp, I argued we should concentrate on work. And my problem was, my argument was, look, the most important thing is to change the balance of forces in society, basically, so that like, the working class, most broadly drawn, has more power and can exercise its influences. We cannot assert our interests. We cannot at the moment. I really find it very, very difficult. And so whose interests are determining the way that, like, the green transition is going to happen? Well, like I can't remember his name now, the head of BlackRock. He has, they're putting a lot of effort into this to lobby, which, when I think there will be I think Labour will get in. I think it'll reduce a little bit, but it's a bit like before Blair got in, the Tories had blown themselves out basically, and they have now. They've totally blown themselves out. I'm pretty sure Rachel Reeves, who is my MP, I'm pretty sure her instincts are going to be going with this, well, we let private capital sort it all out sort of thing. But like there's you can only do that if you don't create a big, if there's not a movement around there saying no, that is the problem. That is the problem. Handing over this huge amounts of money so that like the inequalities of society just get exacerbated. We lose more and more power. We are left as like these sort of like feudal serfs renting off our of these people who own absolutely all of the infrastructure in society, which is sort of what we do now. If you want an image of the future, look at Elon Musk jerking off on Twitter. But for every bit of infrastructure we want forever to massacre George Orwell. And on that bombshell.
I think that's a brilliant place to stop. Thank you, Keir, for being a brilliant guest and talking about literally everything. This is the part of the show where we give a bit of love to the fighters, the healers, and the conservers of the world doing their best to help out all of us. It's the shout out. Keir, who do you want to give a bit of love to this week?
I want to give a shout out to my mate Isaac Rose, who is just across the Pennines there in Manchester. Is involved in Greater Manchester Tenants Union and Greater Manchester Housing Action, who do loads of really good organising around housing, and he's involved in particular in this campaign called Block the Block, which is this campaign to stop this purpose-built student accommodation, 13-storey building being built, basically in an area of social housing. It's a really interesting campaign. They've got a community plan, an alternative plan for the area and all that sort of stuff, and he does loads of good work. So big up, Isaac.
Fantastic. And for any of you who are out there who are doing the good fight, we love you, we appreciate you, and I hope you'll join us again next week. Good night. We'd like to say a massive thank you to all of our supporters on Patreon, with a special shout out to Lizzie, Jill Burke, Kaylee Woods Hartley, and Guillermont. If you'd like to join these amazing people and support the show, head to patreon.com/G&D Media UK. And if you can't afford to help us out, please leave us a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much.